Well, there are many ways of defining mindfulness, but probably the most direct and operational definition of mindfulness is the simplest. It's the awareness that unfolds when we pay attention on purpose in the present moment, non-judgmentally. So when we pay attention in the present moment, pay attention on purpose in the present moment, non-judgmentally. And you can hear from that definition that there are elements to mindfulness. There are components. So the first one is this intention on purpose. So we pay attention on purpose. So there's an intention. We're deliberate about it. We're also deliberate about the paying attention, which is about the quality of attention itself. And we human beings have an enormous capacity to shape our ability to attend. We also know that it's very easy for us to be distracted, for our attention to wander, to waver. We know as well that often enough we're required to have a very steady and concentrated sense of attention when we have to write a report, when we have to drive long distances, when we have to listen closely to conversations, when we're reading a book, when we're studying. And so this capacity to in many ways cultivate our natural attentional abilities is part of mindfulness. And then, of course, there is this this quality of nowness in the paying attention on purpose in the present moment. It sounds simple, of course, but it's easy for us to not be present. We know this. We know that often enough, just by looking at the mind or studying the mind for 5 minutes, that we'll see that often we're in the past. We're thinking about the past. Often we're thinking about the future. It's not wrong to have thoughts about the past. We have often wonderful memories about the past, painful memories as well, but that might inform us about the present. And of course, we do have to plan for the future. So mindfulness isn't suggesting you don't plan for the future, but you probably notice as well as I that it's easy to live in the past or live for the future or live in the future. But when you think about it, very directly, very empirically, we have to make decisions always in the present moment. All of our decisions are in the present moment. All of the stresses we experience in our life are in the present moment. All of the pleasantness in our lives is in the present moment. So this paying attention on purpose in the present moment and then non-judgmentally, well, what does that mean? It's an attitude. It's a way of meeting life in all its variability, not necessarily preferencing one kind of experience over another. And of course, we do preference one experience over another. We'd rather have a pleasant experience than an unpleasant experience. And yet, pleasantness and unpleasantness is coming to us all the time. I'll say that again. And so, of course, we'd rather preference pleasant over unpleasant. Makes a lot of sense. But of course, pleasantness and unpleasantness are arriving all the time, unexpected most of the time. Sometimes from inside our own organism, sometimes from the world around us, the people around us. And so learning to meet those without so much judgment may allow us to develop new eyes, new ways of seeing the world, new options before us, rather than to simply be caught up in the usual ways that we have learned to meet the world, which at some point in our lives may have been very evolutionary, but at other points in our lives become counterproductive. They no longer serve our greater needs. So, of course, people ask all the time, well, what value is this paying attention on purpose in the present moment non-judgmentally? Well, ultimately, it has everything to do with seeing our lives more clearly, seeing situations more clearly, seeing situations with a greater sense of understanding, so that we can act in ways that are more effective, so that our decisions can be more accurate, so that the ways that we meet the world might be somehow impregnated with kindness, or with a sense of gentleness, or a sense of curiosity, or openness, or interest. Those kinds of qualities, or patience, allow us to be in relationship to ourselves, to the people around us, and the world in new ways. And so you could say in some ways, mindfulness is very good training in learning to stand inside difficult situations, good training in learning to be more patient, good training in learning to be more deliberate about focusing and sustaining a concentrated mind when the world is pulling us from one thing to the next very rapidly. And yet we all know we need to sustain our concentration much more directly. We need to be able to, in some ways, to harness our own sense of internal productivity. Not so much always in a functional sense, but in a sense of both its functional application, like when we have to write a paper or we have to sustain a conversation with people. We have to be in a meeting where we're required to listen. And yet listening is not easy for any of us. It's easy for us to get distracted. So there are virtually infinite numbers of ways that this paying attention on purpose in the present moment might be tremendously valuable to us, in small ways and in large ways. Think of all the ways that our children notice when we're not fully giving them our attention. I know for myself, that's always a painful moment when I realize that I'm only partially directing my attention towards my children, or towards my wife, or towards one of my patients, or towards one of my colleagues. And that capacity to know that, rather than that creating a very big sense of guilt or judgment, might be a wake-up call, a way for me to redirect my attention, to give myself back to fully to that person or that situation, over and over and over again. As well, it has a great deal to do with how we meet the stresses and challenges of everyday life. We now know that Stress is a major risk factor for our health, for the state of our health. It's a major risk factor even for the length of our lives. We didn't know this 30 years ago when we began the stress reduction clinic and mindfulness-based stress reduction. We had certainly strong inklings of it, but now the science is really suggesting it's the case. And even the possible mechanisms by which this works in our everyday lives. So learning to handle the stresses in our lives more effectively may be one of the really important elements of or outcomes of mindfulness. Another may be in the whole area of what's often referred to as being on automatic pilot. What does that mean? Well, it really means that much of our lives we're simply operating out of very conditioned reactions. So if you think about the possibility of being more responsive, having greater choice, versus being reactive, which is kind of automatic, which goes on by itself, and which is largely conditioned from the past. Most people say they'd rather be more responsive, and by that they mean they'd rather have more choices, even when they're in very familiar situations in which they've acted in a particular way. People come to realize maybe there are more possibilities here, more ways of liberating myself from the past, more ways of meeting a situation in a new way, in a novel way, certainly in the world of business and commerce and really human relationships more generally. We're always being called on to meet situations freshly, with what is often called a beginner's mind, a mind that isn't so plagued by or imprisoned by the past, by the ways that we've always done things. And ultimately, isn't that what we want for ourselves? We don't want to feel as if we're kind of like robots. We're just acting automatically. It doesn't engender our sense of being alive and fresh and engaged. Same in the domain of what's often called resilience. Our capacity to be more resilient, to be able to, if you will, meet situations, develop a sense of mastery, is becoming increasingly important in this modern contemporary world, where everything is going faster, where we're being required to learn new things all the time, change careers 3, 4, 5, 6 times in the course of a lifetime. Our capacity to be more resilient, to be able to meet situations more fluidly, more flexibly, to feel some sense of, and the only way to meet situations more fluidly or flexibly is to have more stability of mind, our thoughts, our emotions, so that they don't run our lives so much of the time. So in my own experience, resilience is in part developed through this sense of stabilizing the mind, making it more focused, steady, stable, much like a mountain is stable and steady. And on the other hand, also recognizing that the mind has this incredible capacity for what I like to call buoyancy, some ability to rise, to kind of lift off, to just the way a cork would bob below the surface in a stormy sea, it bobs back up to the surface. So that ability to be both stable and buoyant seems to me to comprise a lot of what we call resiliency. And we now know from good scientific research that the human being's capacity to be more resilient can be cultivated, it can be developed, it can be grown, but it has to be deliberate. And so in many ways, you could say that mindfulness is a very deliberate discipline. A very deliberate discipline that asks us to pay close attention to our actions, our behaviors, our minds and bodies, all in service of becoming freer, more liberated, more capable of meeting the world with a sense of clarity and kindness and directness. So it's probably useful for me to say something about what MBSR is and what it isn't. It's an approach that is grounded in a form of medicine called mind-body medicine, and probably every experience that we have as human beings has some kind of mind-body experience, because we're not fragmented or separated into many different parts. We're actually a single, unified whole. But we often do feel fragmented. We often feel split off from parts of ourselves. And so in many ways, mind-body medicine is an aspect of medicine, or a specialization in medicine, that is beginning to study more and more detail the relationship between what we typically call the mind, our thoughts and our emotions, what we call the brain, which is a structure, an organ structure, and what we call the body. And the research is extremely exciting about the way the mind shapes the brain, and the brain shapes experience in some ways, and in turn, the brain is very plastic, and so it is shaped by experience, which is very exciting because of the whole discovery in the last 10 to 15 years of what is called neuroplasticity, which means that the brain is continually reshaping itself, and it's continually reshaping itself through the medium of experience. So our experiences actually shape our brain, which is incredibly exciting. And so when people ask, well, is MBSR a therapy? Our answer is no. It's not a therapy in the usual sense of, for instance, cognitive therapy. But we also say, and I think the research is underscoring this, it's actually describing how it's so. It's therapeutic. In fact, it's highly therapeutic. That's why so many physicians refer their patients to our programs. That's why physicians all over the world are referring people to MBSR programs, where they're able to, and they have an understanding of them. So not necessarily a therapy, but highly therapeutic. And how the distinction we make between it being a therapy and not a therapy is that, at least as we see it, MBSR is mindfulness is a way of being, and MBSR is one form of mindfulness that actually is designed to help people learn about themselves, about their experience, about the ways that they meet the world, about the ways they live their lives. And that kind of learning usually fosters growth. People get excited, enthusiastic. Because it's more than just information. It's about their actual lived everyday experience. And when people get excited about that kind of learning and that kind of growth, there's a possibility for a kind of healing or making whole. That doesn't mean your condition goes away. It doesn't mean all your symptoms go away miraculously, not at all. But that the way that you are in relationship to them might change radically in ways that are liberating for you, that give you larger degrees of freedom, or that you're really discovering that you have larger degrees of freedom. You are freer to learn and meet the world and meet your life in new ways. And that's incredibly exciting to people, particularly to adults who rarely, as adults, are in learning situations or novel or unique learning situations where they are actually studying themselves. They're studying how the mind works. They're training the mind in new ways. They're learning more about their own bodies, and then applying, if you will, that learning or integrating that learning into their everyday lives. And so in that sense, mindfulness becomes a way of being rather than simply a therapy that you do for some number of days or weeks or months, and then the therapy is over and you're cured or not. But it's an adventure. It's kind of an odyssey that goes on across decades, across the entire lifespan, if you want it to. And so in that sense, it is not a therapy in the usual way we think about therapy, but it can be highly therapeutic because it's about discovering in new ways that are direct, that are not something you learn in a book or that you learn from somebody else, about being alive. And I think in the end, we all want the taste, and maybe thousands of tastes, of actually being alive and present to being alive and knowing we're alive. And that's incredibly exciting to people.